Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 3, Episode 16. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, we have a solo episode today, and I've really been looking forward to it because it's focused on an area of retail that at one level can be pretty tactical, but I actually think in a very real way, it is some of the most strategic decisions that a merchant can make.
Yeah, it's as we get into, it's not as if private label or private brands, we'll talk a little bit about the distinction there, which I think can be a useful one. It's not as if they're new, but I think we're seeing it play out in many different ways, many interesting strategic ways. So we'll dig into that a little bit and talk about some of the best examples of companies that are out there trying new and different things in the face of this new world we're in.
All right. Well, before we get to that, let's talk about our top 3 things that are in the news. We're actually recording this on November 11th, Singles Day, 11/11, which is, I think, and we don't want to get into the numbers because they're very easily found, but I think it is the biggest day, e-commerce day. Like the numbers are just mind-boggling. Like I was looking at JD, 48 billion in a day or a couple of days. So fascinating. Alibaba as well. I was briefed actually by Alibaba about what they're doing for this 11/11, this Singles Day. What's your observation of this whole thing? Maybe there's some lessons for us all to learn from that market.
Absolutely. For years, in fact, I made my first trip to China to take a look at what was going on in retail back in, I think, 2007 maybe, and have been trying to stay on top of it since then. And I often say to retail clients or just other people, it's absolutely worth looking at the state of innovation in China, particularly in retail. Yeah. Alibaba certainly gets a lot of press with their new retail, just kind of their version of omnichannel, I guess. But JD and a host of others, and it's not just retail; it's payment technology, logistics, robotic fulfillment, you name it. There's just a lot going on there. So I absolutely think it's worth looking at. And, you have to make your translation from. I don't mean translation from Mandarin to English, but the translation from some of the unique dynamics of the Chinese market to the U.S., to Canada, to the U.K. But they're definitely leading edge on a whole number of things.
Well, and the news coming out was that, and Alibaba was talking about this, that, it can only go up for so long. Now, of course, there's been a big shift thanks to COVID. They were like 30% pre-COVID. Unlike everywhere else in the world, they had a bit of an acceleration as well. I mean, as you say, the market evolved differently. It started more .com than physical and kind of has evolved. But it's fascinating because it just comes back to the role of stores, very important role of stores, and the interplay between, it goes back a couple of episodes, right? The interplay between what is e-commerce anyway, when people are walking in a store, free shippo, you and I were talking about free shippo off mic, they're shopping online on a mobile phone, and they're not even taking the groceries home. There's someone on a bicycle that takes it home for them. Like, it's just, the blur is real when you think of the Chinese market. Right on. All right, well, let's talk about earnings. Lots of different earnings coming out over the past week. We could spend a whole episode on just talking about earnings, but sum it all up for us, because, how do we kind of frame this in a couple of 3 things that you've observed from this earnings cycle?
Yeah, I was making note as we do during the week as the stories we want to talk about, and I ended up with like 15 companies that had earnings reports. And I thought, well, we're not going to go through all this. This isn't CNBC, and there's other reasons not to do it. But when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, there's a little bit of the kind of the stores strike back, dead cat bounce sort of narrative, and perhaps epitomized by some of the more traditional apparel companies like a Ralph Lauren, or just this morning, again, you mentioned we were recording this on Thursday, Dillard's, big regional department store, posting really great sales increases and pretty solid profitability. And I think, as you try to dissect the numbers, is this suggest that these mature brands are somehow having this big renaissance and are really going to be remarkable going forward? I'd say no. This doesn't speak to that. What it speaks to is they're comparing against a period where stores were closed, where people were not spending nearly what they would normally spend on apparel and accessories. And we're also in a moment where, because of shortness of supply, we haven't seen as many promotions. And so the gross margins are very good. So I think we're in a moment in time for maybe another quarter or two with some of these brands. The other kind of characteristic, I think, and we touched on this last week with Wayfair's earnings, Peloton reported this past week, and they've seen the boom that was caused by COVID really slow down a lot, and therefore their profitability got hit. So I think there's this bounce back kind of phenomenon from brands that were hit very hard. There's some brands that certainly got a real unusual push because they were in the home or home fitness or work from home kind of space. And that's being tempered. The other thing I think just to keep taking a look at, and I know we did get into this a lot with Wayfair last week, is some businesses like DoorDash, which reported huge sales increases, but worsening profits. Some of the resale companies, these disruptive brands, again, where they got this big boost because of this huge shift to e-commerce that's now moderating a bit, still can't seem to make money in what would seem to be kind of a perfect storm. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack, going through this sort of noisy period where we kind of rebalance a bit to closer to normal, regression to the mean, whatever you want to call it. But, when you go to the underlying economics, why is it that DoorDash still loses so much money? Like, where is the pricing, the cost piece? Because presumably they're past the peak of spending on creating awareness or past the peak on building out their technology, right? Like at this point, it's kind of cost of goods sold, which is really delivery drivers against the price, against the cut that the restaurant companies get. So I think really starting to pay attention to those go forward margins is going to be interesting as we hopefully get to a period that's a little bit more stable than we've seen.
By the way, we should tell the people that we are going to wrap our season 3 in December. I think it's our last episode of season 3, and we've been renewed for season 4. So we'll
folks at the network said yes.
Yeah, it was as we said last time. It was touch and go, but we did. We are going to do season 4. We'll pick it up again, actually around NRF in January. I think is when we'll launch our season 4. We have lots of stuff to continue to talk about, so stay tuned for that. But I'd love in season 4 in 2022 to talk about this intersection between, how do these folks make money? We're not really a restaurant food service podcast, but there is an integration between grocery, right? This grocer rant. A lot of the grocers have upped their game, particularly now, right? They've had a lot of people, they've been the beneficiary of a lot of transference of volume from the food service perspective. So they're taking a good hard look at how do we not just make plates of roasted chicken on a Wednesday night special, but how do we actually make, and then how do we make good restaurant quality food? And then therefore, how do we integrate into these delivery services? Because they need to play in that in some way, shape, or form. So I think there's lots of food for thought, if I can make that. All right, well, let's end last and actually probably least big changes at Facebook from a naming convention perspective, which always brings up for me that old joke, never metadata, that I didn't like. Their new name is Meta. And interesting, buried in all this kind of stuff, all this noise is physical stores. What the heck is Facebook and physical stores? What is going on here? They think they could turn the business around by getting physical.
Once again, physical retail, apparently not dead. Again. It's interesting, you think about Amazon being the behemoth in e-commerce, but now actually has close to $20 billion in sales through physical stores and really doubling down on that. So that was something I think 5 years ago, when a few of us were predicting that they would make a big move, not necessarily the Whole Foods thing, but just more broadly, because they were going to need stores to accomplish certain things. A lot of people thought that was crazy. Google's opened a store. So we're just seeing some, I guess, uncharacteristic moves you would think on the part of some of these digitally based brands. But I think in the case of what I understand Facebook's trying to do is they're trying to be able to demonstrate this new metaverse, which I'm still not sure I entirely understand. But, a lot of the technology, the virtual AR, VR sort of things, to be able to demonstrate that is, some cases you have to first expose people to it in real life. So just like we've seen showrooms on the part of some of these digitally native vertical brands, because sometimes, customers want to see it in person, try it on or whatever, and they may always buy in the future online, but in order to kind of get that awareness, get that experience, get that connection, physical stores are pretty good at doing that. And certainly Facebook or Meta has the money to experiment with this. So I think it's an interesting move. We probably should talk about what the metaverse means for retail. I'll have to figure out what the hell the metaverse is before we do that episode. But some people apparently think it's going to be big.
If you're listening to this, check out our YouTube site. We've got a very active YouTube site where we put both bonus content, expanded episodes. We chop up some of this conversation. So if you just want to hear the bites about our views on 1111 or the metaverse or whatever, we kind of it's snackable bites, so to speak, on YouTube. Smash that subscription button so you don't miss a single episode or a single moment of the thought leadership that's coming out from us here. Anyway, well, listen, without further ado, and there's been much ado, without further ado, let's get to our episode talking about private label, because it's a fascinating discussion. So let's kick that off too.
Well, part of the reason we wanted to have the episode, I think, is to kind of unpack, as we like to say, some of the different aspects of this, try to sort out some of the semantics and some of those kinds of things. But it's mostly because private branding strategies seem to be becoming more important to retailers as part of their overall strategy. Not that they're new. We'll probably touch on that. Like, certainly not new, but different,
right?
And more important, more attention. And I think we're also seeing, when we think about exclusive merchandising, that there are strategies from some of these newer brands, like digitally native brands, which in essence are exclusive kind of private brands, either only available online or in many cases now available in their own stores.
Well, as you said, private label as a broad catchment term has been around a long time. Tesco in the UK, for example, big private label. Loblaw created this President's Choice brand of chocolate chip cookie, which elevated what in many consumers' minds was, private label, so to speak, on the shelf was a cheaper, cheerful, more economical. And then this whole other genre came up where it was actually better for the same price. But before we get too far down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and speaking of rabbit holes, there's a bunch of interchangeable terms. And why don't we kind of create some, why don't we chalk the field, so to speak, a little bit between a private brand, controlled brands, captive brands, proprietary brand, store brand, house brand, there's a lot going on there. And I don't want to, neither of us want to be at the bottom of a rabbit hole, but many of these are actually interchangeable, but not always, right? So talk about that for a bit.
Well, the fundamental idea really is that a brand is exclusive to the retailer. Now, we'll talk about some nuances there. But it's exclusive to the retailer, and the retailer is somehow or other controlling it, putting it together. They may have help on the outside. Certainly, they're not necessarily manufacturing it, but they are responsible for the brand strategy, the packaging, how it fits in their assortment strategy. In many cases, very actively involved in the product development and sourcing. So it is exclusive to a retailer. So yes, house brand, captive brand, owned brand, most of these things I think pretty much mean the same thing. I think the two distinctions that are worth talking about, one is what often people call a private label versus a private brand. And I do find that people use those terms often interchangeably. I think it's useful to make a distinction there. I think the way I look at it, a private label, you're kind of just filling a gap in your assortment. It's really about price. So if you go back to when there used to be generics, or like you were talking about, a lot of supermarkets, pharmacies, they would have a lower price version, kind of a generic version of the national brand. And so it's very much about this is pretty much the same or essentially identical in some cases, like with pharmaceuticals, to the national brand, but it's cheaper.
And for the retailer, it's better margin generally.
Right. Yeah. Because you're really taking advantage of either the consumer understanding that acetaminophen is the same, whether it has the Tylenol name on it. Right. So why don't I just pay 30-40% less? But also, if you're the retailer, you're not paying the packaging and all the branding costs. So yes, you're typically able to just basically take the cost of goods sold, mark it up a little bit, and make a pretty good margin. So everybody, the retailer wins, the consumer wins because they save some money. But it's really about a price value proposition. What started to come, as you pointed out, in the supermarket industry, happened in the department store industry, particularly at places like Sears, Montgomery Ward, others back in the day, was starting to create private brands. So the distinction being that you're actually trying to create equity in the name of the product, and you're trying to help the customer understand that there is something else above and beyond simply the kind of pure functional benefit. So really almost, certainly in the case of Sears, in the case of Tesco and others, some of these really big players, in many cases, the consumers didn't even necessarily realize that they weren't national brands. Craftsman was for many years, Kenmore Appliances was one of the most powerful national brands. It just turned out, at least for most of Sears history, you could only get it at Sears. So I think there's a distinction. And as some listeners will know, as you certainly know, I spent a lot of years at Sears, and we actually were a little bit different in that we kind of used Kenmore, Craftsman, Die Hard, some of our other exclusive brands, both as kind of that private label, as well as kind of a premium brand. You know, we went across a wide range of price points, which isn't too common. So in some cases it was, hey, you know, this is the opening price point dishwasher, and you can get the Kenmore version for 10% less. But other times it was for the same price as the other brands, the GEs, the Whirlpools, whatever, you can get even more features at the same price. So either way, there was kind of a value equation of if you're price oriented, you can save some money for not so fully featured, or get more. But either way, again, the point of it was to have it part of your overall merchandising strategy, to have some specific goals strategically. But typically it's to create a point of differentiation and give you better margin and, you know, more control, I guess you could argue, over your destiny. Just quickly, the second distinction, though, because we're talking, you know, when we talk about supermarkets, we talk about department stores. You know, we're talking about retailers that carry multiple brands. They're multi-line retailers. So their private brand or private label strategy is part of a mix of things they're trying to do. But you also have exclusive branding strategies in the case of direct to consumer, digitally native vertical brands. You know, as much as we talk about the Warby Parkers and Bonobos and everything, this is not a new strategy. LL Bean, Land's End, Sur La Table, Williams Sonoma. You can go through a list of what were originally mostly catalog brands that eventually opened their stores. And for the most part, they only carry their product. And for the most part, the only place you can get that brand is on their website or in their stores. So again, strategically, it's about creating differentiation. And in the case of the standalone retailers, you know, they have a vertically integrated supply chain. So there's also opportunities for them to earn greater margin and, you know, really more control the brand experience.
So let's talk about private label, private brand in the context of your work in terms of being remarkable. What role does it play? We've talked about differentiating, but as a retailer, why would you? And you talk often about, listen, it's no longer time not to be remarkable. So how does this fit into a strategy that retailers can set themselves apart overall, including the products?
Well, yeah, I dig into this a little bit in when I talk about essential number 7, memorable, in my book, Remarkable Retail. Go through a bunch of different ways to be remarkable, and one of them is this idea of being the only place. Again, it could be from the perspective, like we talked about, with these fully integrated brands, whether it's, you know, the Nike store or it's the Bonobo store or Duluth Trading Company. You know, the list goes on, where if I like that product, I have to go to their website. I have to go to their store because that's the only place to get it. It's not sitting on a big floor with 12 other versions of a khaki pan or whatever. So I think it can be very important in a vertically integrated strategy, where I think it's playing out more from kind of the wholesale multi-line retailer dynamic is from giving customers a reason to choose one multi-line retailer over the other. So we've seen, I think one of the best at this for sure is Target. You know, Target has developed, and in fact, they've had a lot of things going on in terms of consolidating smaller, which were basically private labels, into more mega brands. And so I think they have 5 or 6 of their own exclusive brands that are over $1 billion in sales. And so, yes, it gives them margin opportunity, but it gives them product that you can only get at Target by going there, or by going to the website. So I think
that historically would be the brand's a consumer brand's push on the retailer. Basically, I'm going to put so much money into the market that if you don't have my product or brand in your store, you will not be a destination. And so
Correct,
that
right.
is the other side of the coin, right? In other words, everyone wants to be a destination. So you're fighting back the fear, saying, well, geez, if I don't have that product, people will go to another retailer. So you're trying to own that.
Right.
Again, own the relationship, or just own that experience to be remarkable versus other main brands, right?
Yes, and I think the two, maybe there's more, but the two that pop to mind that are two things that have really shifted in recent years. One is with the internet, it's very easy to price shop for national brands, right? So if you want I don't know, Mr. Coffee or something, right? You just Google Mr. Coffee and you go, oh, I can get it, for $29.99 on Amazon delivered the next day. That's where I'm going. And so if in the old days of department stores where you carried a lot of those kinds of brands, you had to go to those stores. Now you can get a lot of these products almost anywhere, and price often becomes the determinant because it's Mr. Coffee Pot, whether you get it at Macy's, Bed Bath & Beyond, or Amazon, right? So I think part of the push to create these exclusive brands or to dial up the exclusive brands is it can't be price shopped. But I still think it gets back to what is that reason to get consumers to traffic your store? What is that reason to have them come back and develop loyalty with that store? You point out an important thing. I mean, it does turn out that certain kind of magnet brands have spillover effects that are very, very powerful. So, but I do think the internet online shopping has caused more retailers, particularly more of the kind of middle of the road retailers, to try to find ways to not be so prone to price shopping on like items. I think the other thing that is becoming more and more important, and definitely we'll take this on in a future episode, is there's this big transformation in terms of brands, both up and coming, but also established brands going direct to consumer. So where vendors were reliant on their wholesale multi-line partners as the place for people to get stuff. Now, when they're opening their own stores, or like if you're Nike, and not only do you have your own stores, but you now have a really great direct-to-consumer presence, you don't necessarily have to go to the department store to go see the Nike products. And Nike's, as we've talked about before, and a lot of people probably know, Nike's been pulling back from a lot of those wholesale distribution partners. So now if you're that department store, or you're that specialty retailer, and you don't have Nike available to you, or you don't have whatever, it might be luxury department stores. I've seen a lot of the classic iconic brands develop their direct strategy. So if you're Neiman Marcus or Saks, maybe you can't get some products that were important to you before, or maybe you're kind of like, why do I want to support them when they're competing aggressively and trying to steal my customers away? Maybe I want to do something more proprietary.
The other thing I wanted to talk briefly about, and our podcast is more oriented to retailers than it is on the vendor side, but the vendors think about this interestingly. We should spend a minute on that, because they would think, in response to retailers' requests for exclusivity, they would channel manage their products. You can have, the coffee pot with the white handle, and you, retailer B, would have the coffee pot with the blue handle. Hopefully some more differentiation than that sometimes. But they would purposefully channel manage. They put different kits together in different assortments. So that's one side of it, of the equation. And the other, I guess, would be, and maybe this is a whole other discussion because the dynamics and interplay is, well, why don't you just make it for us?
Well, I have a fair amount of experience on this in a bunch of different categories and a bunch of different price points. And I think it is pretty complex, because certainly the retailers want more differentiation. And sometimes that's, their own brand, but sometimes, like you say, it's a different version, or, Neiman's, we talk about,
exclusive.
We bought it different, or we have a capsule collection or whatever. There've been a lot of creation of these so-called derivative brands, a second line, which might, you might sell at a higher end department store, but then it's at Dillard's. So the manufacturers have a stratification strategy, like you say, managing their channels. The retailers are trying to create a sense of differentiation. And I think this gray area, because it's certainly helpful when we reworked our private brand strategy in apparel when I was at Sears a million years ago, we were trying to do a mix of, we wanted to create our own brands, but we recognized it was going to take time to have the customer understand them, a lot of marketing. It was often beneficial to do what I think you were talking about with Martha Stewart is, how can we borrow a recognized brand, but move it into our strategy? So that led to the Land's End acquisition. So Land's End was essentially a captive brand only available at retail at Sears while being an existing national brand in its own right. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of skin the cat here. I think that the underlying drivers are differentiation, hopefully finding higher margins. I think we'll come back to in a second some of the challenges there, but in theory, the ability to have better margins and also the ability to kind of control your destiny. If you've got more of your assortment that is under your direct control, in theory, it gives you both strategic advantage and financial advantage, but easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah. Let's transition to the whole margin issue. So, if you're a retailer listening to this, you're like, this is great. I make more margin. I get my my own destiny. It's both a defensive and an offensive strategy, defensive against what brands could do to me, and then creates a destination. But on the other side of the ledger, I think of things like, well, you just mentioned, right? If you're going to build a brand, you got to spend marketing dollars. Those are your marketing dollars, not the national brand's marketing dollars. I think about what you're not getting, which is trade spend dollars, right? You're not getting co-op dollars. It is not you almost would say, in other words, well, why wouldn't retailers have every single product on the shelf of private label if it all makes some more sense? But it's more complicated. Let's talk about the financial implications and the decisions as you would think about them.
Well, I think, first of all, you do have some, aside from the J. Crew, LL Bean kind of discussion we had before, you do have stores like Trader Joe's, Aldi's that are essentially all private brands, right? So that's very much
Decathlon,
part of their whole strategy to do it that way. Though I think, the category dynamics there are different. When you start to get over more to fashion merchandise, it gets a little trickier, right? Because you're dealing with trends become more important, fabrication, design, it's constantly changing. So to your point, it takes a while to get customers to understand these brands and why it's worth considering them, why it might be worth paying more or maybe paying less, but moving away from a national brand that's been around forever. So the marketing part of it is tricky. Product development and sourcing is tricky. It's
Expertise.
One thing.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Companies like Target, I think Macy's and others have been pretty good at this for a while. They have very significant investments in design teams and a lot of these vertically integrated brands. Land's End I know best, Duluth Trading I know well. They have very significant product design teams, sourcing teams, supply chain management and everything. But if you're designing and having your product made in, let's say, Vietnam, you own that inventory, you are taking quite a lot of financial risk in a way that you may not be buying a national brand with return privileges and things like that. Or like you say, having trade dollars, leveraging their overall advertising, some of which will benefit you just to kind of get your fair share. So there are definitely trade-offs. And there's some examples of companies. Kohl's, if you look at them, I'm sure there are others, but Kohl's is sort of top of mind. About 10, 12 years ago, I think, they made a big push into private label and private brand. And I think they got about 60% of their mix to be somehow or other exclusive captive brands. And they really overshot the runway. They had a hard time on sell-through on quite a number of the brands because they didn't ultimately, the customer didn't understand them well enough. And I think it turned out that customers were coming to Kohl's for, a different mix. Not that they couldn't buy some private brands, but they hadn't really created, they had too many private labels, not enough private brands, basically. So I think it's a tough balance to get right. But I think we're just seeing more and more retailers actively pursuing this strategy because of the price shopping, because of in some cases, lack of availability or lack of trust in the flow of their historical vendor partners. And I think I need to create another reason or a different reason to come to the store and, be part. But I think what I worry about, if you aren't, like, Target has been really good at private branding for a while. They've made some very significant moves in the last few years that are going pretty well. Folks are probably aware that Amazon has already a ton of private labels and private brands, and they're a great case study to look at the difference, because they clearly have a bunch of things which are all about price. Amazon Basics, and then they have brands that people probably don't even realize are owned by Amazon, because they've got their whole separate image. Wayfair does a lot of this too, and so there's clearly companies that are investing a lot of money in it, and these private brands, private labels become a big part of their sale. Other folks that are kind of looking at it now, I mean, it's a tough road to hoe from either doing something very basic, price oriented, to really building a meaningful portfolio of brands. So, for example, we're seeing, and I have confidence that it'll work out pretty well, because Mark Triton came from Target, but he's really developing the private branding, private label strategy for Bed Bath & Beyond as a point of differentiation, as well as margin enhancement. So a lot of things. The other one I wanted to mention briefly, which is kind of interesting, and it's a little bit like what you were talking about with Martha Stewart, and I was mentioning with Land's End. It's kind of like, everything old is new again. A lot of these digitally native brands, which, probably beating the dead horse about how it turns out they need stores, their own stores, but it also turns out they need wholesale in many cases. So many of these brands that got all this venture capital funding, they went from, we're only going to be online, pure play e-commerce, to we're only going to open our stores, to, actually, we're going to sell wholesale, which isn't direct to consumer, right? Casper. I mean, right? Even just, if you look at Target and Nordstrom alone, they've got quite a few of these digitally native brands that they have kind of semi-exclusive distribution with. But you're absolutely right. Casper, Purple, some of the bed in the box guys are selling through traditional mattress stores or big home furnishing stores. So that too is, when you think about it from the retailer perspective, it's not their own brand, in that they are designing and developing it and taking the risks that we described earlier. But it is this push towards differentiation and not exclusivity, but semi-exclusivity. So, getting your Harry's razor or your Quip toothbrush at Target, it's not the only place you can get it, but it is one of either very few, or it's the only physical place you can get it. So again, I think the strategic reason is still about differentiation and being, maybe not the only place, but a handful of places, or a different experience. Because if you are online only, except for being sold in a Target or being sold in Nordstrom, it is a different, a little bit different value.
Well, and there's lots of great examples. As I said, we're going to wrap this part of the episode up. But, Joe Fresh from Loblaw started as, let's put apparel in with their groceries. And then Joe Fresh became a huge brand and $1 billion brand. And we've seen that. I wanted to comment on two quick things. One is, back to this ownership of the private label brand. When things don't go well, when you don't forecast perfectly, there is no return to vendor privileges. Your name, that brand is on that product.
Yeah, right.
Return to self, which means, the traditional ways of either going to a B channel or going into a TJX, maybe not the best option for you. So now you've got, probably going to have to take more aggressive markdowns, and it may just wind up in another country very far away, because you're not anywhere near your brand, which is margin erosion writ large. And we should have mentioned this at the beginning. One of the reasons we've been thinking about this so much is because Amazon, and you mentioned Amazon with their basics, they get knocked on all the time for, hey, they just want to get to know what sells well and create private brands. Like, that's right. Like every other, right. So, I just wanted to wrap this episode, because we often talk about, Amazon, what's going on in there. People are kind of saying, bad Amazon. I'm like, well, that's actually what, retailers have part of this thinking and strategy. Maybe people want basics, maybe they don't, but it's, you can make your own private label from learning or not, because that's a big decision, right?
Well, I can tell you for sure, a lot of the knowledge that informed the strategies for Craftsman, Kenmore, Die Hard, the litany of private brands we had at Sears back in the day was rooted in our understanding what sold and customer insight. Now, we didn't have the kind of data and ability to leverage insights back then that Amazon does today. And you could certainly argue that Amazon has the ability to sort of force products to the front of the line in the way, I sort of envision if you walked into the Sears store, I mean, the salespeople kind of did this because they were incented to push Kenmore, but it's almost like you couldn't walk down the aisle because every single time, there was Kenmore blocking your way. Online, there are things you can do with the real estate and leverage that power that I think arguably you could say gives Amazon a bit of an unfair advantage. This is an old playbook, really.
I mean, I guess because, if you think of the retailer shelves, the old thing, who gets eye level, right? Maybe it's your private brand that's eye level and the national brand that's, down at the bottom of the shelf. So, true, Amazon, other people can put it more forward in their particular vehicle. But again, it's a familiar playbook. It's nothing new here. Let's move on because there's a lot of things to talk about a business like Amazon. I don't think that's one of the ones that's so interesting from what are they doing different or wrong if we want to if we want to be judgy about it,
I think the big takeaway, at the risk of being a little repetitive, is, and it fits back to this idea of being remarkable, which is even very good is not good enough anymore. It just raises the bar. It's always been important to have a unique value proposition to be differentiated. That's not a new idea in business at all. But because of the commoditization, or because it's so easy for customers to shop for price or shop for alternative, that really puts the pressure on creating even more differentiated product. And this idea of being the only place or one of very few places to experience, I think, has become more important. And that is driving both retailers developing their own more aggressively and maybe in some cases in different ways, but also some of these kind of semi-exclusive partnerships. So I think we'll see more and more of it. That, as you pointed out, the caution is, when you get it wrong, there aren't as many places to hide. So it's a balance for sure.
Well, a great discussion. And again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but I think we really hit the high notes for anyone thinking about these things. So it's very, I think it was a great episode. Because every now and then private labels in the news are one way, shape, or another. But I love the strategic discussion around it. So a great episode, and let's wrap it here. If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast platforms, so you can catch up with all our great interviews. Subscribe so that just automatically shows up. Tell your friends, and also in new insights and new episodes will show up every week. So tell your friends. Because that will help us share the word, the good wisdom. Now, be sure and check out, us out on our new YouTube channel. Not so new anymore. We got a couple episodes up there, and just look for Remarkable Retail.
And I'm Steve Dennis. You can check out more of my work at my website, stephenpdennis.com, or on Forbes, or on Twitter. And please check out my second edition of my book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, available just about everywhere books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast and a bunch of other stuff. You can find me on LinkedIn, learn about me on meleblanc.co. All right, Steve, great episode. Look forward to chatting again next week. Be safe and have a great rest of your day.